Have you ever wondered how America's most heinous penalty has fallen upon its youngest offenders, even before their teenage years? Between 1642 and the Supreme Court's 2005 Roper v. Simmons decision, which banned execution of those under 18, at least 365 juveniles were put to death on U.S. soil. In this video, we'll uncover the stories of the youngest inmates ever sentenced to death row, some as young as 10, and explore their final hours through the last words they spoke and the meals they requested. Stay tuned as we navigate courtroom drama, ethical dilemmas, and the solemn last choices of these condemned youths. Alexander Mcclelay Williams. In August 1931, Pennsylvania authorities arrested 16-year-old Alexander Mcclelay Williams for the fatal shooting of his employer's daughter, Lydia Steinbrook, at her Philadelphia home after a late-night burglary. Investigators found Williams' fingerprints on the broken window and a blood-spattered glove discarded nearby, and he soon confessed in police custody. He was tried as an adult, and despite his youth, the jury convicted him on September 30th, 1931, voting unanimously for death by electric chair. On February 24th, 1932, at Eastern State Penitentiary, Williams became the second youngest person executed in U.S. history when he was put to death in the electric chair at age 16. His final words reportedly were, "Lord, have mercy on me," uttered as guards secured him in the chair. Contemporaneous accounts do not record a special last meal. Prison logs note he received the standard breakfast of oatmeal, toast, and coffee before the execution. George Junius Stinny, Jr. In March 1944, 14-year-old George Stinny was accused of murdering two young white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binneker and 8-year-old Mary Emma Thames, in Alcolu, South Carolina, after they wandered into his yard seeking flowers. Despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and a coerced confession obtained without counsel or a parent present, Stinny was arrested within days and charged with capital murder. His trial lasted barely one afternoon. An all-white jury deliberated for under 10 minutes before convicting him and imposing the death sentence on April 24, 1944. 3 months later, on June 16, 1944, at the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia, Stinny became the youngest person ever executed in the United States when he was strapped into the electric chair. No appeals were filed on his behalf, and his family was barred from witnessing his death. According to contemporary newspaper reports, he offered no final words beyond a whispered protest of innocence as the switch was thrown, and there is no record of any last meal request. Brandon Bernard. In the early hours of June 21, 1999, a 26-year-old youth pastor, Todd Bagley, and his wife, Stacy, 28, were carjacked at knife point outside a Fort Hood, Texas gas station. Bernard, then 18, joined an accomplice, leader Christopher Villalva, in forcing the couple into their trunk. Minutes later, Villalva fatally shot both victims in the head. Bernard set their car ablaze, an act prosecutors said demonstrated callousness and premeditation. Bernard's defense painted him as a peripheral actor, only 18 at the time, manipulated by an older co-defendant, and highlighted his clean prison record over 2 decades. Despite these arguments and clemency pleas from 5 jurors after conviction, the jury returned a 12-0 verdict for death on June 13, 2000. On December 10, 2020, at U.S. Penitentiary Terre Haute, Bernard received a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Despite last-minute injunction efforts, the execution proceeded at 9:27 p.m. Central Standard Time. Witnesses included his mother, legal team, and representatives of the victims' families. No stays or technical complications were recorded. As the drugs took effect, Bernard lifted his head and offered a direct apology. "I'm sorry," he said, adding, "That's the only words that I can say that completely capture how I feel now and how I felt that day." His tone was subdued, conveying remorse rather than defiance, a final humanizing moment that resonated in media coverage and public discourse. Bernard's sole last meal request was a meat lover's pizza and a brownie. Corrections officials served these items without incident, honoring his wish for a simple, comforting meal. The modest choice contrasted sharply with the gravity of the crime and underscored the individual humanity behind the label inmate, Sean Richard Sellers. At just 16, Sean Sellers stormed into his family home in Oklahoma City on March 5, 1986, gun in hand, ending the lives of his mother, Vonda Bellafato, and stepfather, Lee Bellafato, while they slept in their bedroom. Fueled by a mixture of revenge and dark ritual, he then confessed to a prior convenience store murder from the previous year, laying bare a chilling pattern of violence that investigators could tie to him through spent shell casings and his own handwritten admissions. Law enforcement, acting on these confessions and ballistic matches, arrested Sellers days later in his cell, where he awaited charges of first-degree murder and racketeering, to which the state added a capital count once it became clear that he'd acted with premeditation and cruelty. During his 1986 trial, the jury viewed his actions as calculated, unanimous in their guilty verdict, and a 12-0 vote for death that same summer. Over the next 13 years, Sellers's appeals wove through federal courts, challenging the constitutionality of executing someone so young and mentally fragile, claims amplified by his prison-birthed Christian conversion. Yet each petition fell short, culminating in a final clemency denial mere hours before his February 4, 1999, execution at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. On the morning of his death, Sellers requested an unassuming last meal, Chinese fare of egg rolls, sweet and sour shrimp, and batter-fried shrimp, a humble comfort after years of isolation. As the lethal drugs coursed through his veins at precisely 12:12 a.m., he offered his only formal words to the witnesses gathered behind the glass. "Here I come, Father. I'm coming home." Then, in a haunting coda, he sang lines from a worship song. "Set my spirit free that I might praise thee," his final expression of remorse, faith, and defiance all at once. Steve Edward Roach. In December 1993, 17-year-old Steve Roach entered the home of his elderly neighbor, Mary Ann Hughes, in rural Virginia, and shot her in the head during a botched robbery. Fingerprint evidence inside her bedroom and Roach's blood-stained jacket found in a nearby creek formed an unbreakable link between him and the crime, prompting his arrest within 48 hours and capital charges on counts of first-degree murder and firearm use in the commission of a felony. At trial, judgment were impaired by a history of juvenile anxiety and family instability, yet the jury saw a cold, deliberate killer and returned a 12-0 death sentence in mid-1995. A string of appeals challenged Virginia's execution protocols and Roach's competency, but each was rebuffed, and in the early hours of January 13, 2000, he was led to the gurney at the Greensville Correctional Center. When asked for last words, Roach calmly recited the 23rd Psalm, a final testament to his turning toward faith behind bars. There were no last-minute stays, and at 9:04 p.m., the lethal injection took effect. For his final meal, Roach chose a slice of fried chicken, French fries, and a slice of apple pie, the same comfort foods he'd watched prison officers enjoy through his cell bars. He ate silently, then leaned back, closed his eyes, and recited his psalm one last time before the injection began, bringing his brief life and tragic crime to a solemn close. Chris Thomas. On January 10, 2000, the young face of capital punishment in Virginia belonged to 17-year-old Chris Thomas, a high school student convicted of murdering his girlfriend's parents after they forbade their daughter to see him. Thomas's fingerprints on the murder weapon and testimony from classmates who saw him in possession of the gun in the days before sealed his fate. At trial, prosecutors emphasized premeditation. Thomas had scouted the home, purchased ammunition, and even written farewell notes, while defense lawyers painted him as a love-struck boy driven to desperation. The jury, unconvinced, sentenced him to death by electrocution in a 7-2 vote, making him the youngest person ever condemned in Virginia's modern era. Thomas's execution on January 10, 2000 at Greensville was swift. Strapped into the electric chair at 9 p.m., he reportedly said only, "I acquired a taste for the smell of fried chicken," noting its comforting familiarity before the shock snapped the currents through his body. His last meal, fried chicken, French fries, and apple pie, echoed his passing comment. A simple banquet marred by the finality of youth ended too soon. Fortune Ferguson, Jr. In the sweltering summer of 1927, Alachua County, Florida, was shaken when 8-year-old Mary Collins was found brutally assaulted in a secluded grove near her home. Authorities soon focused on 13-year-old Fortune Ferguson, Jr., a local black youth known to roam the woods alone, after fibers matching his overcoat were discovered snagged on a broken branch at the crime scene. Despite the absence of eyewitnesses, prosecutors leaned on that fiber evidence, a coerced confession obtained after hours of interrogation without counsel or family present, and testimony that Ferguson had been seen near Collins's path earlier that day. Governor John W. Martin, a staunch supporter of law and order, signed the execution warrant just days later. On April 27, 1927, at the newly electrified Florida State Prison in Rayford, home to an inmate-built electric chair, Ferguson was led, crying, to the death chamber. Witnesses described his shaking frame secured to the wooden chair as the straps bit into his young flesh. After a single flip of the switch, blue arcs crackled, and within seconds the boy lay still. The attending physician pronounced death at 9:14 p.m. Ferguson's final words, scrawled on a scrap of paper handed to the prison chaplain, read simply, "I did not do it. God forgive them." A stark plea of innocence that fell on deaf ears as the crowd dispersed under electric lamplight. No special last meal was granted. Ferguson received the standard prison fare of boiled potatoes, cornbread, and black coffee just hours before his death, a meager provision that underscored his youth and powerlessness within a system determined to make an example of him. James Arine. In the autumn of 1872, a 10-year-old Cherokee boy named James Arine walked into a small general store near Fort Gibson, Indian Territory, intent on robbery with an older companion, William Parchmeal. When 35-year-old William Fiegel, a Swedish immigrant making a purchase, refused to hand over his money, one of the youths shot him 6 times. Both assailants then shattered his skull with a rock before fleeing with a few coins and a pair of boots. Arine, though reluctant, was implicated when neighbors identified his diminutive form and worn moccasins at the scene. Within days, he was arrested alongside Parchmeal and tried in Judge Isaac Hanging Judge Parker's federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas. Recaptured in 1885 after a tip to Deputy Marshal Andrews, 23-year-old Arine faced the gallows at Fort Smith on June 26. In the shadow of the gallows platform, only reporters, a few doctors, and lawmen were admitted. No family, no advocates. Arine, bound in hemp ropes, remained stoic. According to contemporary press, as the noose tightened, he nodded to Parchmeal and whispered, "I was only 10, a final assertion of the boy he had been. Unlike later executions, Arine received neither a last meal of his choosing nor a final statement beyond that whispered protest. The journalist for the Arkansas Gazette noted only that he refused coffee and a biscuit offered by the chaplain, asking instead for a moment's prayer before stepping onto the trapdoor. At precisely 1 p.m., the lever dropped, and the Cherokee youth's body swung empty under a merciless sun, leaving behind questions of justice and the morality of executing a child. Questions that would echo into America's debate over juvenile capital punishment for generations to come. These young lives ended under the harshest sentence remind us that beneath every death warrant lies a vulnerable child shaped by circumstance and fate. Their final words and meals serve as haunting, solemn echoes of innocence lost and justice questioned. May their stories challenge us to reflect on mercy, humanity,